can't believe I'm finally back doing a Folklore and Fairytale Friday. We are officially on my second channel, and if you're not familiar with what exactly is going on, essentially this series is where I either do my makeup or I do my skincare routine while I talk about different folklore and fairy tales. Now, I did get the inspiration of this from one of my favorite YouTubers, who is Bailey Sarian. She does the murder makeup Monday, but instead of doing like true crime, I'm doing more of like cryptids, folklore, fairy tale. The name kind of explains itself. And I was originally doing this on my main channel, The Beauty Breakdown, but through the algorithm and things like that, I kind of talked to you guys about it, and we all decided together it'd probably be best to just make a second channel where I could still make this content, because I definitely enjoy doing it, but I could do it in a way that wouldn't affect my main channel. This series is going to be kind of continually evolving as I kind of figure out how it's going to work, but this is where I'm at today. If you guys like this type of content, be sure to like this video so I know to keep going with this series, as well as subscribe and hit the notification bell. And I need to hear you guys' feedback in the comment section down below, because it's always interesting to see what you guys have to say. And you guys have definitely given me some cool ideas. Like, I did one on Asian mermaids a couple months ago, and that one was a recommendation from you guys. Today we are going to be talking about the Haechi or Haechi. It is an interchangeable name in Korean, so I'm just gonna say Heichi for this video. And essentially what a Heichi is it's a mythical beast that has a lion-type body, and in some forms a goat-like head and a horn coming from the top of its head. A lot of times along the body it will have like scales, and in Korea the Heichi has like a bell hanging from its neck. It's like a watchdog type of creature, and it's said that in the wintertime it likes to live in the forest, and then during the summertime it resides in the swamps. Now, typically Heichi are known to eat fire but play in water, and for some reason the Heichi has a taste for kids, so it's often kind of used as like a teaching mechanism for children, because like I said, the Heichi not only eats kids, the Heichi is supposed to symbolize justice. Now, the main role that a Heichi plays is essentially the arbiter of justice. They're the beast that knows right from wrong just innately. So it's said that in ancient Korea, the emperor was the only one that was able to possess and own a Heichi. And whenever there was some form of argument or there was some type of political confusion going on, the Heichi would innately know who is right and wrong. And he would do this through headbutting the person who is wrong, which I imagine with a horn would be quite an uncomfortable thing. That's actually why they have the horn, I'm pretty sure. It's to like ram people. Now, like I said, it's well known that the Heichi is something that only the Korean emperor can possess. So no other person can own a Heichi. And because of that, and also some other symbolic things we'll get to in a second, you'll notice that there are a lot of Heichi kind of planted around Seoul. Now, most notably throughout history, the Heichi statues have been erected in front of palaces. Specifically, the one I'm going to be talking about is Gyeongbokgung Palace. Now, when Gyeongbokgung was initially built, which it was built in the 1300s, specifically 1394 by King Taejo, the palace was the place for all political functions. It's essentially the center of the universe for Korea. And when this was built, it was very important to pick a place that would recognize and represent all of these attributes that a palace does. Oh my gosh, I was not paying attention to how much I was filling in my eyebrows. I was a little heavy-handed there. So buildings are like this today somewhat, but specifically back in ancient Korea, a lot of important buildings were built off the basis of feng shui or geomancy. Both of these are somewhat similar, but essentially with feng shui, it's really important to get the harmony built in with the building, and things like the direction that buildings are facing or elements that are surrounding it were really important. So where Gyeongbokgung was specifically built in Korea was considered by feng shui standards the optimal and perfect place to build, because where it's located is surrounded by mountains, and in feng shui, mountains are kind of thought to be like the backbone of a building, and also kind of the balancing out, so the yin and the yang. There's a river obviously that runs through Seoul. So having all of those elements combined, the location where Gyeongbokgung Palace was built was considered the most prime location you could build something so important. Now because of this, Gyeongbokgung actually roughly translates to palace greatly blessed by heaven, and since its conception by the first king, a lot of the presiding kings after that had continually built upon Gyeongbokgung. Now, why I'm bringing up Gyeongbokgung is because the story of Gyeongbokgung actually has some relevance to the Heichi. The elements are very important when it came to the building of Gyeongbokgung, and because it was surrounded by mountains, it was said by geomancers and feng shui experts at the time that the location itself, although it is a prime location because of the mountains, which represent fire, the palace might be prone to more destruction and disaster, specifically in the forms of fire. My face is so dry. Ugh. Now, Heichi, besides being symbolic for justice, they were also known to be a form of protectors. Now, because like I said, they do eat fire, they're thought to be guardians against fire. So that's why you'll actually see statues in front of Gyeongbokgung erected of the Heichi. Now, they're right in front of Gwanghwamun, which is the entrance, the main entrance going into the palace. And besides being protectors against the negative energy or negative fire energy, they were also symbolic in the sense of being a representation of the justice going on at the palace. So since they're at the entrance, once you pass through the entrance is essentially saying, once you pass through this threshold, you're entering a place that is perfect in all ways as far as justice goes. So all of the people residing in there, including the emperor as well as the other governing factions, were considered to be of high moral character. Now, this was also something I was reading that I thought was really interesting that kind of displays how Koreans thought of the Heichi. Heichi were also thought to kind of anchor themselves in not only justice, but also anchor themselves against evil. Since they have the large mouths, that latches them onto the past, which is considered like the traditional way to go, and they refuse to let go of that, kind of keeping true to like the cultural standing and maintaining that. Besides being like a ward of evil and all the natural disasters, negative and fire energy, Heichi were also placed at the entrance because it was almost like a traditional sign of like, take your shoes off before you enter the palace. Because I'll read the quote, "From here on, this is the place where the king resides, so you have to walk down the horse." So this is actually where people who would come in on like horse carriages would have to park their horses, because you obviously can't ride those babies into the palace. Now, Gyeongbokgung, boy, is rife with their own tumultuous past. So the story of Gyeongbokgung, like I said, it was built during the 1300s. Now, it's kind of weird because Gyeongbokgung has a lot of history with not only bad events, but fire specifically. So as I was doing my research, I was like, I'm not sure these Heichis were doing their jobs, but okay. So the first fire event was a major fire event that happened during 1553. Now, it's just recorded that there was a massive fire event that occurred at the Gyeongbokgung Palace. I tried to look it up and figure out what caused this fire, and I could not find what caused it. All I could find were records of how bad this fire was. It happened during the 8th rule of King Myeongjong, and it said that not only did it burn down a lot of the palace, but it also burned a lot of clothes and books, scriptures, just anything that would have been in the palace, it took down with it. Now, King Myeongjong, who was ruling at the time, made sure to immediately make reparations to the palace. So he enlisted 2,200 subordinates as well as 1,500 laborers to start immediate reconstruction. And they were actually able to finish the reconstruction of the palace the following September. So that was a pretty fast period considering how much damage was done. Now, unfortunately, not that long after, in 1592, there was another fire that occurred at the palace. So poor King Myeongjong was probably like, I just have terrible luck with this palace. Because realistically, it happened pretty much 40 years after the first fire. Now, the cause of this fire was the Imjin War, which was a Japanese invasion on Korean soil. Now, during the Imjin War, it's kind of debated as to whether the Japanese came in and intentionally burned down the palace, because a lot of times throughout history, through different wars, countries will come in and like try to destroy anything that's traditional or cultural to a country to remove that from history so they can replace it with their own. So it's not known if the palace was set on fire specifically by the Japanese invaders, or if it was actually, at the time, Korean people who were upset with the government, because at the time the royal family actually had evacuated from the palace during the invasion. So a lot of the native people in Korea felt a little deserted by their royal family or the ruling family, and so they might have come in and invaded. It might have been a combination of all of the above. There's different transcripts and retellings of exactly what happened, but either way, the poor palace was burnt down, and again, like 90% of the palace was destroyed. Now this time, the palace was not immediately reconstructed. Instead, the palace was essentially left derelict and abandoned for about 300 years, so 276 years. It was just left empty and essentially in ruin. Now, in later years, some form of reconstruction was made, and the royal family again was residing in Gyeongbokgung Palace. And this next story is really awful. Like, as I was reading it, I was just shocked. Like, jaw on the floor. Just the cruelty of, again, war is astonishing. So this event happened in 1895 with Empress Myeongsung, or Queen Min, so we're going to call her Queen Min, and she was assassinated at Gyeongbokgung Palace. So how this happened, again, the Japanese forces were trying to come in and place Japanese culture and remove Korean culture from the area. And there were some Korean sympathizers at the time with the Japanese forces who were almost like rebellion factions to the native Koreans, even though they were native Koreans, if that makes sense. And Empress Min, she was trying to make friends with Russia in order to protect Korea from Japan. Now, naturally, this really pissed Japan off, and they knew that they had to get rid of her because she was obviously a vocal proponent of Russia and a vocal opponent of Japan. And what better thing to do than, I guess, assassinate her? They actually came in, there was like over 1,000 men, and this included not only Japanese agents or assassins, but it also included some of, like I said, the native Koreans who had sympathized with the Japanese forces. So they essentially invaded Gyeongbokgung Palace, stormed the grounds, and Queen Min tried to actually dress in the royal court's garments to try and hide herself among like the lower lady courts. But they eventually were able to find her. They dragged her out from where she was trying to hide, and they essentially assassinated her right on the grounds in front of everyone. So this included her son and included her daughter-in-law. They actually watched as their mother was like chased out by all of these men and killed on the grounds. And why I'm bringing this story up, because again, it has to do with fire. So after she was murdered, her body was taken to Daeguk Pine Tree Forest. Her body was then desecrated, doused in kerosene, and then lit on fire. Now, this event in history was considered overtly cruel. Now, despite it being war and bad things happening in war, this event in particular was looked down upon even by people who were for the Japanese forces. This political statement by some was considered to be a hideous event, crudely conceived and brutally executed, as well as unspeakably barbaric. And those are the words of people who were not for Empress Min, that they were against her and her ruling. So like I said, that happened in 1895, and that was really just the precipice of even more Japanese invasion in Korea. So as you guys may or may not know, there was a Japanese occupation that happened during the 20th century in the early 1900s. Specifically in 1910, the Japanese government started to come in and remove cultural architecture and buildings from the area. And of course, Gyeongbokgung Palace was targeted. Now in 1915, there was the Chosun Industrial Exhibition. And during this industrial exhibition, it kind of was an opportunity for Japan to show even more their control over Korea. So not only did they destroy and remove markers of Korean buildings and architecture, but they also like combined them with their own, showing like Japanese Korea. Stuff was not only destroyed, again, over 90% of Gyeongbokgung was destroyed during this time, but things were moved. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Hwangemun Gate was one of the things that was moved. And that's where the Heichi were placed in front of as the entrance of Gyeongbokgung Palace. Now, it was actually moved because they were trying to make space for Japanese government buildings, so they moved it to another place. The movement of Gwanghwamun Gate took place in 1926, and then, as you guys know in history, a couple decades after that was the Korean War. And the reason that I bring this up is because, again, Gwanghwamun Gate was a very identifiable part of Gyeongbokgung Palace. It was very grandiose, and essentially it was one of the few remaining pieces of, I guess you consider the original Gyeongbokgung Palace, although as we know through the history, Gyeongbokgung Palace got reconstructed throughout the centuries. But in 1950 during the Korean War, even this piece was destroyed by fire. So all of the wooden parts of Gwanghwamun Gate were destroyed, and the only thing that was really left was the stone foundation. Now, thankfully, there is a happy ending for Gyeongbokgung Palace. Gyeongbokgung Palace, as you guys know, has been restored, and all of the restorations had been completed in 2010. So a lot of the pieces that remained were moved back to their original location, and the reconstruction, I think, started in 1990, so you can see it took about 20 years for the complete reconstruction of Gyeongbokgung to take place. But it is kind of interesting because, again, the Heichi are supposed to be the protectors against not only fire, but negative energy and destructive events, and it just seems like poor Gyeongbokgung Palace was just the focal center of all of these things. And again, of course, it makes sense because it really is symbolic of Korea. I mean, it was placed in Korea's capital, and it was a place of government and where all of the ruling families resided. But I mean, come on. All of the fires, it just is kind of like a weird coincidence. Like I said, when I was doing research for this, that was not the direction I was planning on going when I was looking into Heichi and the cultural implications of what they mean. When I started reading about, okay, they're guardians against fire because they're fire breathing and they eat fire, and they're supposed to protect against bad events, and then reading about all the fire events that happened at Gyeongbokgung Palace, this feng shui thing might have a little more to it than I think we give it credit for. Now, Heichi are also symbolic in modern day Seoul and Korea. They were actually elected the mascot of Seoul in 2008, 2009, so you'll actually see them everywhere besides just Gyeongbokgung Palace and other historical spots. You'll also see them on the sides of taxi cabs. I think they're called Heichi Taxi actually, which is kind of funny. And you'll also see little stuffed animals and mascots in general. So it's considered a lighthearted, fun type of creature nowadays. Heichi are also seen on government buildings or justice buildings, also the badges of judges and things like that. So you'll see them kind of built into also justice departments and organizations in Korea. Now, you guys might be thinking, hey, I've seen similar looking creatures in other countries, and that's because it's actually thought that the Korean Haechi originates originally from China. China's version of Heichi is really hard to pronounce. It's spelled Xiezhi, that's the romanization of it. Xiezhi. So I apologize. I know there are probably native speakers out there, and I'm probably gonna butcher that, but it's obviously not my native tongue. So Xiezhi is what the Chinese version is called. Now, similar to Korea, the Chinese version has the body of a lion or almost a horse in some aspects, and a goat-like head. And with the Chinese version, it specifically has one horn. Sometimes in Korea there will be two horns. And so sometimes it's equated to a unicorn or dragon every once in a while, but it's very similar in stature. It looks kind of stocky, also very muscular, and has the horn. Those are the main things that dictate that it's a Xiezhi. This is considered a wild beast. It's also fire-breathing, and it's said to be able to understand human language, although not being able to communicate, obviously, in the native tongue. Now, this document I'm too scared to pronounce, which is an ancient Chinese dictionary. The Xiezhi is a cattle-like beast with one horn. In ancient times, it settles disputes by ramming the party at fault. And in another Chinese text, it's stated to be a beast that lives in the deep bushes or mountains in the northwest region. It is described as a clean yet mysterious beast. The appearance is said to have a single horn protruding from the Yusuma Myeon, which is, I guess, a cow head and a horse's face, with split claws and blue scales covering the whole body. That's why I'm doing the blue here. They are said to have wings in their armpits, live in the swamps in the summer, and the pine forest in the winter. So obviously we're seeing a lot of similarities between the Xiezhi in China and also the Heichi in Korea. And like I mentioned, there's a heavy emphasis on the Xiezhi being the animal of not only truth, but of justice as well. Overall, it's the moral judge of right and wrong. Now I'm going to go ahead and apply my eyeliner as well as some lashes and come back, because there's just no way I'm going to be able to talk about the story of where the Xiezhi comes from without poking myself in the eye. And I have to say, I like my eyes unpoked. Now this next story is kind of long-winded, but it does at the end, kind of like my Gyeongbokgung story, has to do with the Xiezhi, because this is one of the oldest stories in Chinese history. And this story basically takes place a long time ago, like before even history started. And this is how the general organization of human society was laid down in China. This was said to take place even before the Qia dynasty, which was 2070 BCE. So essentially over 4,000 years ago is when this is thought to have happened. This time was called the era of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors. This is where a lot of the mythical rules and deities in ancient Chinese history come from. And these are essentially like cultural heroes. So these are considered like godlike kings or godlike emperors, and these demigods are considered to have superior knowledge as well as high moral code and representative of the ultimate person in a sense. So much so that their superior knowledge is said to have laid down the foundation for a lot of different things, not only in ancient Chinese history, but also that we see today in modern America, China, and around the world. And these are things like the origin of how to use fire, how to build buildings, how to garden, the invention of silk culture as well as medicine, and besides just those type of everyday life things, also things like the calendar, astrology, religious reform, and also the idea of a centralized government. Of these influential leaders, there was Emperor Shun, who was thought to be the person who was the inventor of the code of law. Now, talking about kind of like his origin story and how he came to rule, the ruler before him was actually Emperor Yao. Now, Emperor Yao was ruling during a time that China was going through a lot of natural disasters, including the Great Flood of China. Now, of course, like a lot of other natural disasters throughout history, this was leaving a lot of the Chinese citizens not only desolate, but starving, homeless, and they were just really struggling trying to figure out what to do. Now, Emperor Yao was trying to figure out what to do and how to save his people, so he was referring a lot to people around him and trying to figure out who was going to come after him after he was passed away or done ruling. And he had 9 to 10 sons. It differs in different texts, but he would look at his sons who were supposed to succeed him in ruling and think, woof, I do not have a lot to pick from here. Evidently his sons were kind of deadbeats in the sense that they were more into the finer things of ruling, like the food, the drinking, the women. This is where Emperor Shun came to his attention, because his council again kind of directed him towards Emperor Shun. Now, Emperor Shun, despite having a lineage in royalty, was someone who was thought to be very humble. He was hardworking and considered just overall very good-natured and a good person. Despite that, he really had no reason to be that or have that type of demeanor. In fact, he had a really rough upbringing. He had not only siblings that were constantly trying to throw him under the bus, but he had, the stereotypical evil stepmother who was constantly terrorizing him throughout his childhood. Now, eventually, he grows up and he was kicked out of his house as soon as he was old enough by his stepmother. He, despite this, continued to be very good natured and just a natural born leader. It seemed like a lot of people would gravitate towards him. And so Emperor Yao decided to test him. He gave him a dowry of a little bit of money as well as a house with some land and also a couple of his daughters. Even after being gifted like land and a house and some ladies, he still would manually work on his farm. He lived humbly, and he also did this so well, he encouraged his new wives to live that way as well. His virtuousness and good nature basically passed all the tests that Emperor Yao had placed in front of him, and so Emperor Yao kind of brought him into the government to not only just kind of work with him, but eventually kind of king with him, and then eventually become the final or the sole emperor. Now, finally, after Emperor Yao was done ruling and passed away, Emperor Shun had a minister named Go Yao who was essentially his minister of justice and law. These two wise men created the first code of law. Now, the reason I bring this up because Go Yao actually possessed a Xiezhi. He would essentially use the Xiezhi when he couldn't decide who was right or wrong. Now, this whole situation was actually recorded by a Chinese scholar named Wang Cheng from the 27 to 100 CE, and he states, at present in the courtyards of public buildings, Go Yao's Xiezhi is painted, and scholars declare that the Xiezhi is a goat with one horn, which by instinct knows the guilty. When Go Yao, administering justice, was doubtful about the guilt of a culprit, he ordered this goat to butt it. It would butt the guilty but spare the innocent. Accordingly, it was a sage animal born with one horn, a most efficient assistant in judicial proceedings. Therefore, did Go Yao hold it in high respect, using it on all occasions. Consequently, it belonged to the class of supernatural creatures of good omen. Like I said, it's really interesting because the story of the 3 sovereign and 5 emperors, it really is like an origin story in itself. And not only do you have these pivotal characters who really form society, but you also have these mythical beasts intertwined. And you still see that throughout today. Even military policemen of the Republic of China have a Xiezhi on their badge. And you can also see it on the what's the hammer thing called? The grommel? The gavel. The gavel in the court systems of the People's Republic of China also has a Xiezhi engraved on it. So that is the story of the Korean Haechi as well as the Chinese Xiezhi. I hope you guys enjoyed this story as well as this like little get ready with me style video. Let me know again in the comment section down below if you guys have any other recommendations on topics you guys would like me to do. I'm so excited I'm back into doing this, and I just find it so fascinating even just doing the research on a lot of these topics. I learned a lot, and that's exactly why I really love these Folklore and Fairytale Fridays, is because not only is it really interesting, like I think we're all drawn to the supernatural as well as the mythical, but it also gives you a lot of context as to what is going on in history at the time, how the people of the time thought and lived their lives. So I just think it's just very entertaining as well as educational. So I hope you guys like this style video. I forgot to mention, I am going to link everything down in the description box that I used because I'm sure some of you guys are going to be curious as to how I got these beautiful eyeshadows. So I will go ahead and leave a list down there as well, and a playlist to my other Folklore and Fairytale Fridays if you guys want to watch some previous ones. As always, I hope you guys are happy and healthy, and don't forget to rate, comment, subscribe, share with your friends and family, hit that notification bell, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye guys!